Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is Venom. Let's take a look at a video.
Did you know that Jesus was not crucified on a Friday? And we can also pinpoint the exact year that he was crucified.
All right, let's see it.
However, the requirements of when the crucifixion actually occurred are laid out in Nehemiah 2, Daniel 9, Matthew 12, 28, John 12, and John 19. And if we strictly look at the details stated within the text, Jesus had to be crucified on a Wednesday, and there's only 1 year that meets all the requirements.
So here we see that two presuppositions are going to be governing this entire argument, meaning all of the data are going to be subordinated to these presuppositions and manipulated to fit those two presuppositions, and they are univocality and inerrancy. The texts cannot possibly disagree with each other, and the text cannot possibly be wrong. If all of the data in the world point in the direction of one of these texts being wrong or one of these texts disagreeing with another text, these two presuppositions are going to demand that the data be renegotiated.
And Jesus states in Matthew 12:40, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And the problem with a Friday crucifixion is that there's no way to get 3 days and 3 nights out of it.
So this is not just a problem for a Friday resurrection, this is a problem for any reconstruction of the resurrection, because the timelines are just squishy in the New Testament. They're not perfectly literal no matter where you're looking, because the Gospels say that Jesus will raise after 3 days. But at least in Matthew, in Mark, in Luke, in Acts, and even in 1 Corinthians 15, we have the statement that Jesus will be raised on the third day. And so already it's a little squishy, and when you look at all of the accumulated data, you can either say, well, we have to take the sign of Jonah as literal and then renegotiate everything else, or we can take everything else seriously and then just say the sign of Jonah was not understood to be literal 3 days and 3 nights. And this is how the majority of Christians throughout time have understood it. This is how critical scholars understand it today. In other words, something's got to give, and the easiest thing to have give is the literalness of the sign of Jonah. That's a lot simpler than trying to change the resurrection from Friday to Wednesday. And as we're going to see, Paul here has to go through some tortured eisegesis to try to make the literal sign of Jonah fit and renegotiate everything else.
Now, Matthew 28 says, "Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn," and that would be Sunday, "Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb." The problem is that in the Greek, the word here, Sabbaton, is translated Sabbath, but it's a plural. Yes, Sabbaton can be translated as week or Sabbath singular or Sabbath plural, but whenever it's translated as a singular, it has the modifier imera, or day.
So this is just not true. While we do see this construction where we have the dative antihimera on the day plus the genitive plural ton sabbaton to mean on the day of the Sabbath, you can just have the plural dative tis sabbasin, referring to a single Sabbath day. You can also have other constructions. In Matthew 28:1, we have this particle opse, which can mean late on or it can mean after. And when you look in critical commentaries, they don't even comment on the fact that sabbaton is genitive plural because everybody already agrees that refers to a single Sabbath day. The commentaries are all arguing over whether opse means late on or after.
So it should say after the Sabbaths. So multiple Sabbaths occur between the crucifixion and Sunday, so it cannot be a Friday, because if the high Sabbath was Saturday, it would only be considered a single Sabbath. Thus, there has to be a high Sabbath and a regular Sabbath between the crucifixion and the first day of the week.
No, there doesn't.
So let's look at the requirements so far. 3 days and 3 nights must elapse between the crucifixion and resurrection as per Jesus' own words in Matthew 12.
This is only true if you presuppose univocality and inerrancy and you refuse to allow the gospel authors to be referring typologically to the sign of Jonah.
The Passover has to fall on a date in which 2 Sabbaths occur in a 3-day period.
This only works if you don't adequately understand or you just ignore how Greek works.
But in verse 9:25, it says, "Know therefore and understand from the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens." So 69 7-year periods. And the biblical calendar is a 360-day calendar. So what it's saying is that from the command to rebuild Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity until when the Messiah presents himself will be exactly 173,880 days.
So there are two reasons this doesn't work. The first is that Daniel 9:25 is not referring to a royal command or decree. The Hebrew there is motza davar, which means going forth of a word, and that is not how the book of Daniel refers to royal decrees or proclamations or commands. It's how Daniel refers to prophecies. It's exactly how the angel Gabriel referred to his prophecy 2 verses earlier. He says, Yatsa davar, a word went forth, and I am here to declare it to you. So the most likely candidate for this word going forth to return and rebuild is Jeremiah's prophecy about the restoration of Jerusalem, which occurs around 604 BCE. Now, there's a lot of complexity in this prophecy in Daniel 9. For instance, 62 weeks and 7, are these happening concurrently or consecutively? Scholars point out that if you understand them to be happening concurrently, and you count 62 weeks of years from 604 BCE, you get 170 BCE. And what happens according to Daniel 9 at the end of those 62 weeks of years? Well, a Messiah is going to be cut off. What happened in 170 BCE? The high priest, Onias III, was killed. And then we have 6 years of stuff going on, and we have the interruption of the sacrifice. And guess what? Just a few years after Onias III was killed, you have Antiochus IV Epiphanes stopping sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple. And that is precisely when most scholars date the composition of the final form of the book of Daniel. And so overwhelmingly scholars agree that this is actually an ex eventu prophecy about the days of the Maccabean revolt. The other reason this doesn't work is because this ignores intercalation to reduce a reference to years to a number of days. Intercalation is when you use days or portions of days or even a whole month to realign your calendar. We do it with the leap year because a day is not exactly 365 days. Every 4 years, we have to add a day. If I said 400 years from today, X is going to happen, and you reduced 400 years to 400 times 365, guess what happens in 400 years? You're 6 months off from the date I indicated. You have to add that quarter day every 4 years, the intercalation. And when you do that with these weeks of years things, nothing works. So this is all manipulating the data and ignoring how these people would actually be talking about these things because they already have the endpoint in mind and they're just trying to look backwards and find something that can be plausibly identified as the starting point. And it just doesn't work for this prophecy.
Looking back at Daniel 9 and that decree to rebuild the city, that came to Nehemiah in Nehemiah 2 in the month of Nisan.
So again, this is not what Daniel 9:25 is talking about, but even if we did understand that passage to be referring to a royal decree, no such decree is found in Nehemiah. That chapter just has Nehemiah requesting letters of safe passage and letters granting him access to timber from the king's forest. A far better candidate would be the decree of Cyrus, which is listed in 2 Chronicles, that the Judeans return to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem. That is a far more explicit fulfillment of Daniel 9:25 if we were to understand it as a prophecy about a royal decree.
So in the only year that meets all the requirements of the entirety of Scripture, Nehemiah 2, Daniel 9, Matthew 12, 28, John 12, and John 19, is 31 AD, and Jesus had to be crucified on a Wednesday.
So again, this whole argument requires we presuppose univocality and inerrancy in order to overrule the data that exist and then make false assertions about what the Greek must be saying so that this all can be made to fit. This is pretty standard apologetic fare.